I had always believed that family meant support and warmth, but one day, in the most unexpected way, I found out they had been planning a celebration behind my back and hadn't even thought to hint at it to me. While they decorated the hall and rehearsed their toasts, I sat alone, shattered and hollow inside. But gathering the last of my strength, I decided to give them a surprise of my own, one they would remember forever, just not the way they had dreamed. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Mary Ann Roberts, and I was 62 years old when I first noticed the whispers. I owned a small bakery in the quieter part of Charlotte, North Carolina, a place where the streets still smelled like fresh bread in the mornings, and everyone nodded hello when they passed by. For most of my life, my days had followed a simple, comforting rhythm: early mornings kneading dough, afternoons frosting cakes, and evenings spent cleaning up, counting the day's receipts, and making lists for tomorrow. My world was small but full. I loved it that way. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. That particular week had started like any other. I woke up before sunrise, brewed a pot of strong coffee, and tied on the apron that had faded from so many washes. It was now barely pink. At the bakery, I dusted the counters with flour and hummed under my breath as I worked. Regulars trickled in: Mr. Harold from the hardware store grabbing his blueberry muffin, Mrs. Green picking up a dozen cinnamon rolls for her church group. It was the kind of life that didn't make headlines, but built memories. But something felt different. It was in the way Sarah, my eldest daughter, stopped mid-sentence when I walked into the room. It was in the way Derek, my son-in-law, gave me a hurried smile and shifted his phone screen away when I passed by. My grandchildren, normally chatterboxes, seemed to exchange secretive looks and giggle whenever I asked what they were up to that weekend. At first, I told myself it was my imagination. Maybe they were planning something sweet for my upcoming birthday. After all, it wasn't every year that a woman turned 63, and my family had never forgotten a birthday before. The thought warmed me. I pictured a small gathering, a homemade cake, maybe a new book, or a bouquet of flowers tied with twine. Nothing fancy, just togetherness. I smiled at the thought as I worked, whistling tunelessly while decorating a batch of cupcakes. I even found myself humming favorite old songs while sweeping the floors at closing time. That little flicker of hope in my chest was enough to make the hard work feel lighter. In the days that followed, the signs multiplied. I overheard Sarah whispering urgently to my younger daughter, Rachel, when she thought I wasn't in earshot. I caught sight of Derek loading large party supplies into his truck one afternoon, trying and failing to look casual about it. There were missed calls I wasn't supposed to notice and text messages hastily deleted when I walked into the room. They were planning something. It had to be something good. I started paying more attention, hoping to catch a slip that would confirm my growing suspicions. Once, when Rachel came to pick up a box of pastries, I teasingly asked if she needed extra for a big celebration. She flushed and stammered something about a work event, but the glint in her eyes betrayed her. Another time, Sarah dropped by under the pretense of needing a cake recipe. As we sifted through old cookbooks together, she kept glancing at the clock, distracted and jittery. She forgot herself for a moment and mentioned needing to confirm the guest list, only to immediately backtrack and pretend she was talking about her office party. I laughed it off. I didn't press. I didn't want to ruin whatever they were planning. Part of me clung to the belief that the best surprises were the ones you didn't see coming, even if you secretly knew they were on the horizon. Still, a small, uneasy feeling began to coil in my stomach. There were moments when I would walk into a room and feel the conversation die mid-sentence. Moments when Sarah's face would tighten with guilt before she smoothed it over with a too bright smile. Moments when Rachel's hug lingered just a beat too long, like an apology she wasn't ready to voice. I pushed those feelings away. I busied myself with baking, with cleaning, with 1,000 small tasks that had always anchored me. I made a point of laughing when I felt like crying, of brushing off the hollowness that sometimes pressed against my ribs late at night when the house was silent except for the creaks of settling wood and the soft hum of the fridge. After all, they were planning a surprise. Surprises weren't meant to feel easy. They were meant to be hidden, protected, revealed only when the time was right. Still, a voice deep inside me, the part of myself that had survived disappointments I never spoke about, whispered that perhaps I should prepare for more than one kind of surprise. Perhaps this time, the celebration wouldn't come wrapped in ribbons and laughter. Perhaps it would come disguised as something else entirely. But I didn't listen to that voice. Not yet. Instead, I baked an extra batch of my famous apple pies and wrote "Happy Birthday, Mary Ann" on a pink sticky note, tucking it into my recipe box where only I would see it, just in case, just to remind myself that no matter what happened, my life, my heart, my hope still belonged to me, and whatever was coming, I would meet it with open eyes and a steady hand. The days leading up to my birthday crept by slowly, each one draped in a kind of restless, buzzing silence. My bakery kept me busy, but even the comforting rhythm of kneading dough and frosting cakes couldn't distract me from the way my mind kept circling the same question: what exactly were they planning? By the middle of the week, I had convinced myself that the big reveal would happen any day now. Maybe someone would slip up and accidentally invite me to what was supposed to be a secret party. Maybe Sarah would show up at the bakery, feigning a random coffee run, only to whisk me off to a surprise gathering full of balloons and familiar faces. I imagined the grandkids running toward me, faces lit up with excitement, shouting, "Surprise, Grandma!" It was that hope, fragile and stubborn, that kept me smiling when I wanted to frown, that kept me patient when every fiber of my being itched for answers. On Thursday afternoon, as the sun slanted low over the rooftops and the first cool breath of fall teased the air, I drove across town to deliver an order of cupcakes to the community center. They were hosting a charity auction that weekend, and I had volunteered some baked goods, happy for the distraction. As I pulled into the parking lot, I noticed a flurry of activity near the adjacent banquet hall. Trucks were parked haphazardly, and people were hauling tables, flower arrangements, and boxes full of decorations through the open side doors. I squinted toward the entrance, curiosity piqued. The hall was a popular spot for birthday parties, retirement celebrations, even weddings. It wasn't unusual to see it bustling this time of year. Still, something about the way the people moved, hurried, excited, a little chaotic, caught my attention. After I dropped off the cupcakes and chatted briefly with the event coordinator, I found myself wandering toward the banquet hall, pretending to study the landscaping. I didn't mean to eavesdrop. I told myself that. But as I drew closer to the open doors, snippets of conversation floated out, carried on the breeze. "Make sure the cake says happy birthday, Rachel. We can't mess that up," a woman laughed, her voice bright and familiar. "And the guest list? Is it final?" Another voice asked, lower, more cautious. "Yeah, it's all set. Just family and close friends. We figured it would be better this way, you know?" A third voice chimed in. "Yeah, we didn't want it getting awkward." I froze. Rachel, my youngest daughter. Her birthday wasn't for another 2 months. Confused, I edged a little closer, pretending to study a nearby rose bush. Through the open doors, I glimpsed Sarah standing by a table, arranging small paper place cards into neat rows. Derek was fiddling with a string of fairy lights, cursing softly when the bulbs refused to stay lit. My grandchildren darted between the adults, laughing and tossing a beach ball back and forth. They were all there, my family, setting up a party I hadn't been invited to. My stomach twisted sharply. For a moment, the world blurred at the edges, the air thick and heavy. I felt like a stranger looking into a life that used to be mine. I stepped back, my heart hammering painfully against my ribs. I told myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe it wasn't what it looked like. Maybe I was jumping to conclusions, but the truth settled over me like a heavy cold shroud. They had planned a surprise party, and they hadn't invited me. Worse, they had gone to great lengths to keep it a secret, to exclude me without confrontation, without acknowledgement. They had smiled in my face, accepted my hugs and my cookies and my unconditional love, all while planning to celebrate without me. I stumbled back to my car, my legs trembling so badly I could barely drive home. The world outside the windshield blurred into meaningless streaks of color. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the initial shock had given way to something deeper, something sharper: hurt, betrayal, humiliation. I sat there in the car for a long time, staring at the familiar lines of my little house, the one that had sheltered birthdays, Christmases, first steps, and graduation parties. The house where I had baked their favorite cookies, mended skinned knees, stayed up late sewing Halloween costumes. All of it seemed so small now, so invisible. I wondered how long they had been planning it. Had they laughed about keeping it from me? Had they congratulated themselves on sparing me the discomfort of knowing I wasn't wanted? The questions circled like vultures, tearing at whatever pride I had left. I finally climbed out of the car, moving slowly, mechanically. Inside the house, the air was cool and still. I hung up my purse, kicked off my shoes, and sank into the old armchair by the window. The sunlight had shifted, casting long shadows across the floor. I sat there, listening to the ticking of the clock on the mantel, feeling the heaviness of the truth settle into my bones. I had been left out, on purpose. There was no other way to frame it, no kind way to spin it. They had decided the celebration would be better without me. I thought of the pink sticky note still tucked into my recipe box, the one that read, "Happy birthday, Mary Ann." It felt like a cruel joke now, a reminder that while I had been preparing for joy, they had been preparing to forget me. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the first stars blinked into existence, a new feeling stirred beneath the layers of pain. Not revenge, not even anger. Resolve. I would not beg for a place at their table. I would not shrink myself to fit into their narrowed vision of family. If they wanted to plan a surprise without me, they would get exactly what they wanted, but not in the way they expected. The next morning arrived wrapped in a heavy fog that seemed to seep into my bones. I woke earlier than usual, my body still aching from the weight of the discovery the day before. The house felt different somehow, larger and emptier, like it had expanded overnight to remind me just how alone I truly was. I moved through the familiar motions of my morning routine: brew the coffee, feed the cat, water the plants, but everything tasted and felt a little off, a little hollow. I sat at the kitchen table, my hands wrapped around a chipped mug, and stared at the calendar pinned to the wall. My birthday was circled in bright red ink, just 2 days away. A note from Rachel was still stuck beside it. "Save the weekend, Mom. Big things coming." I traced the letters with my fingertip, feeling a bitter smile creep across my face. Big things indeed. As I sipped my coffee, I thought about the party preparations I had witnessed. the way they had gone about it, the way they had hidden it. It was not just the fact that I had been excluded that hurt. It was the deliberate secrecy, the pretense, the casual cruelty of it all. And it wasn't just about a party. It was about what that party symbolized. It was about who they saw as part of the celebration of life and who they had quietly decided didn't belong anymore. I refused to let them hurt me in silence. If they wanted to pretend I didn't exist, I would make sure they remembered I had been there all along. By mid-morning, a plan had begun to take shape in my mind, growing slowly but steadily, like a vine finding purchase on an old wall. It wasn't a plan born of spite or malice. It was born of a simple, stubborn refusal to be invisible. I started by making a few phone calls. The first was to the community center. I inquired about reserving one of the smaller halls adjacent to the banquet room they had rented. As luck, or perhaps fate, would have it, the room was still available. I booked it immediately, giving my name and telling them I would handle the decorations and catering myself. Next, I called a few friends, not the ones who always seemed too busy, not the ones who only called when they needed something. I called the people who had shown up for me without fanfare, the ones who had sent handwritten cards after Harold's funeral, the ones who had dropped off casseroles when I had pneumonia last winter. They weren't flashy people. They didn't make a lot of noise, but their kindness was steady, dependable. Every person I called accepted the invitation without hesitation. "What's the occasion?" one of them asked, laughing. "Life," I answered simply. "Just life." After hanging up, I got to work. I pulled out the old box of decorations from the hall closet, the same box I used to decorate for birthdays and anniversaries. I found strings of fairy lights, faded but still twinkling when plugged in. I dusted off a banner that read, "Celebrate every day," in bold, cheerful letters. It was perfect. I baked all afternoon. The warm, sweet smell of vanilla and cinnamon filled the house, pushing back the heaviness that had settled in my chest. I baked sheet cakes and batches of cookies, enough to feed a small army. I boxed them carefully, feeling a sense of purpose return to my movements. The next day, I made another phone call, this one to a local homeless shelter. I arranged for a van to bring over some of the residents to my little gathering. If my family didn't think I was worthy of celebrating, then I would celebrate with people who knew the true value of kindness and company. By the time the evening of the party arrived, I was exhausted but strangely exhilarated. I dressed simply in a blue dress Harold had always liked and pinned a small brooch to the collar. I loaded the car with cakes, decorations, and folding chairs. I drove to the community center with the windows down, letting the cool night air whip through the car and clear away the last lingering traces of sadness. When I arrived, the banquet hall next door was already bustling with activity. I saw Sarah's car, Rachel's minivan, and Derek's big black truck all parked haphazardly near the entrance. Music drifted out whenever the doors opened. Pop songs from the playlists we used to dance to in the kitchen when the kids were small. I didn't linger. Instead, I made my way to my own room, where a few of my friends had already gathered, smiling and waving as they helped unload the food and set up the tables. The room wasn't big, but it was cozy, warm, real. The guests from the shelter arrived shortly after, their faces lighting up at the sight of the cakes and the simple decorations. One older man, whose name was George, shook my hand so earnestly I thought he might cry. A woman named Denise hugged me without asking, murmuring thank you over and over again. Their gratitude filled the room with a different kind of music, one that pulsed with real joy, real connection. Meanwhile, through the thin wall separating my room from the banquet hall, I could hear the distant clink of glasses, the hollow echo of laughter. At one point, Sarah's voice carried over clearly as she gave a toast, thanking everyone for being part of such a special day. I smiled to myself and raised a plastic cup of punch in a silent salute to no one in particular. They had planned a surprise without me, but I had given myself something better, a celebration of life that didn't require permission, a celebration that wasn't about appearances or obligations, a celebration that was mine. And it was just getting started. When the last of my guests had left and the room had emptied, I stood alone in the soft hum of the overhead lights, listening to the lingering echo of laughter and clinking cups. The folding chairs were stacked neatly against the wall, the tables wiped clean of cake crumbs and punch spills. The decorations still hung overhead, a little crooked now, but their cheerful colors refused to dim. I should have felt proud. I should have felt victorious. Instead, as I packed up the last of the leftover cookies and turned out the lights, an unbearable loneliness crept into my chest. The drive home was quiet, the streets nearly deserted. Streetlights threw long, thin shadows across the pavement, and every passing house seemed to whisper with the lives inside. Lives filled with family dinners, shared laughter, the easy comfort of belonging. I drove slowly, unwilling to reach the emptiness waiting for me at the end of the trip. When I pulled into my driveway, the house stood dark and silent, a black shape against the cloudy night sky. I sat behind the wheel for a long moment, gripping the steering wheel with numb fingers. Part of me wanted to stay there, suspended between one place and another, but eventually, habit won out. I gathered my things and made my way up the front steps, each one heavier than the last. Inside, the air was cool and still. The clock on the mantel ticked in the darkness, each second a sharp reminder of how much time had passed, how much had been lost. I dropped the bags onto the kitchen counter and leaned against the edge, suddenly too exhausted to move. My knees buckled and I slid down to the floor, my back pressed against the cabinet doors, the cold tile seeping through the thin fabric of my dress. And there, sitting on the kitchen floor of the house I had built, loved, protected, and preserved for decades, I finally let the tears come. They came in a slow trickle at first, a hot sting at the corners of my eyes. I wiped them away angrily, ashamed even in my solitude, but the harder I fought them, the stronger they grew, until the dam broke completely and I was sobbing in great heaving gulps that shook my entire body. I cried for the years I had given without hesitation. The holidays spent cooking and cleaning, while others enjoyed the fruits of my labor. I cried for the birthdays I had planned with painstaking care, the late-night phone calls answered without complaint, the endless sacrifices that had been so easily forgotten. I cried for the woman I had been, the woman who had believed that love, given freely and without condition, would somehow be enough to ensure her place in their hearts. I cried for Harold, too, for the quiet strength of his hand on mine, for the way he had always seen me even when I could no longer see myself. I cried because he wasn't there to wrap me in his arms and tell me that everything would be all right, that I was enough, that I was loved. The sobs tore through me until I was emptied of everything but breath and exhaustion. I pressed my forehead to my knees, rocking gently, the way I had rocked my babies when they were small and afraid. Eventually, the tears slowed. My breathing evened out. The house settled around me, creaking softly in the cool night air, as if offering a tired, wordless kind of comfort. I sat there for a long time, feeling the weight of the night press down on me. I thought about the party I hadn't been invited to, the laughter that had risen without me, the celebration that had gone on as if I were already a ghost. I thought about the little party I had thrown in defiance, the strangers who had smiled at me with real gratitude, the warmth that had bloomed despite everything, and slowly, a different kind of clarity began to form. This wasn't just grief for what had happened. It was grief for what had been true all along, truths I had refused to see because hope had blinded me. They didn't need me the way I needed them, and that was a wound deeper than any single party could ever inflict. But it was also a kind of freedom, because if they didn't need me, I didn't have to keep contorting myself into shapes that pleased them. I didn't have to keep showing up, uninvited, into their lives. I didn't have to keep waiting for an acknowledgement that would never come. I could choose something different, something for myself. That night, sitting on the cold kitchen floor, I made a quiet vow. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't born of anger. It was a simple, exhausted promise to myself. I would stop chasing what was not mine. I would stop begging for scraps of love from those who had no interest in offering it freely. I would build a life that centered around the people and places that welcomed me without reservation. And most importantly, I would not let their indifference define my worth. When I finally pushed myself to my feet, my body aching, I moved slowly through the house, turning off lights, locking doors. I climbed the stairs to my bedroom and changed into my softest nightgown. I climbed into bed, pulled the quilt up around my shoulders, and closed my eyes. The sadness was still there. It would be for a while. But underneath it, like a tiny ember refusing to die, was something stronger, something waiting to catch fire. Tomorrow would come, and when it did, I would meet it as a woman who had wept. Yes, but also as a woman who had survived. When I woke the next morning, the heaviness from the night before still clung to me like damp clothes, but somewhere beneath it, a stubborn clarity had taken root. I sat on the edge of my bed for a long time, letting the early sunlight filter through the curtains, feeling the slow, steady rhythm of my own breathing. The night of tears had wrung me out, stripped me raw, but in that rawness was something powerful. I was no longer confused. I was no longer pretending not to see the truth. They had left me out, deliberately, and now it was my turn to choose what came next. I moved through the motions of my morning routine with a strange sense of detachment, as if I were observing my own life from the outside. Coffee brewed, toast popped up from the toaster. I washed a few dishes that had been left overnight in the sink. Small, ordinary things that grounded me, tethered me to the present moment. As I sipped my coffee, I pulled out a notebook from the kitchen drawer. A simple, battered thing I usually used for grocery lists and baking orders. I turned to a fresh page and sat there for a moment, pen poised in hand, staring at the blank expanse. And then I began to write. It wasn't a list of grievances. It wasn't a tally of wrongs. It was a plan to reclaim something that had been slipping away from me for far too long. My dignity, my joy, my place in the world as something more than an afterthought. The first thing on my list was simple: create a celebration, not out of revenge, not out of spite, but as a declaration that I existed, that my life was worth celebrating, even if no one else showed up to do it with me. I jotted down ideas quickly, my mind racing ahead of my hand. A small garden party, maybe. Something intimate and beautiful. I could string lights across the backyard, set out a few tables draped in white cloths, gather fresh flowers from the farmer's market. I would cook, not because it was expected of me, but because it was something I loved, something that connected me to myself in ways my family never truly understood. The second item on my list was a little harder: decide who to invite. I knew instinctively that it could not be the same people who had left me out. There would be no empty gestures, no hollow reconciliations built on guilt. I would not force anyone to come where they did not want to be. Instead, I would invite those who had shown up for me in ways large and small over the years. My neighbor Joanne, who had brought me soup when I had the flu last winter. Mr. Alvarez from the hardware store, who always remembered to ask about my bakery even when he was just picking up nails and paint. Carol Simmons, my old friend from the community center, who had once sat with me in a hospital waiting room for 5 straight hours without complaint. People who saw me, people who valued me, people who did not need to be guilted into caring. The third item was perhaps the most important. Celebrate myself, not the mother or the grandmother or the baker or the fixer, just Mary Ann, the woman who had survived grief and loneliness and disappointment without letting it hollow her out, the woman who still loved fiercely, even when love wasn't returned in kind, the woman who was still standing, even after everyone who was supposed to lift her up had turned away. I wrote it down in big, looping letters, underlined it twice. Celebrate myself. It felt radical, almost rebellious. I had spent a lifetime making other people the center of my universe, bending and reshaping myself to fit their needs. Now, I would be the sun in my own sky. By the time I finished writing, the heaviness in my chest had begun to lift. Not completely. Grief is never that tidy. But enough that I could feel the air moving through me again, enough that I could imagine smiling and meaning it. I spent the rest of the day quietly setting things into motion. I called Carol first. She answered on the second ring, her voice bright and warm, and when I told her about the little gathering I was planning, she didn't hesitate. "I'll bring the good wine," she said, "and the biggest bouquet I can find." Joanne agreed to come too, and promised to bake her famous peach cobbler. Mr. Alvarez said he would stop by after work, even if only for a little while. Each yes filled a small crack in my heart, a crack that had been widening for months, maybe years, without my realizing it. I ordered a few simple decorations online: paper lanterns, fairy lights, a banner that read, "Here's to new beginnings." I placed a catering order for a few dishes I couldn't easily make myself, giving myself permission to enjoy the evening without being trapped in the kitchen. Every action, every decision felt like laying a stone along a path that led somewhere new, somewhere better. That night, as I sat in the living room with the notebook still open on my lap, I allowed myself to dream about the evening to come. I pictured the glow of the lanterns, the sound of quiet laughter drifting through the warm summer air, the taste of sweet wine and homemade pie. I pictured faces that looked at me, not with obligation or pity, but with real affection. And for the first time in a long time, I felt excited, not because I was trying to win anyone back, not because I was hoping to prove anyone wrong, but because I was doing something for me, because I deserved it, because even if no one else ever truly saw me the way I wanted to be seen, I would not let that diminish my own vision of myself. I closed the notebook, set it carefully on the table, and turned off the light. Tomorrow, I would hang the lanterns. Tomorrow, I would set the table. Tomorrow, I would celebrate the life I had built, the woman I had become, and the future that still waited for me with open arms. The morning of the party arrived soft and golden, the kind of morning that hinted at the promise of something new even before I stepped outside. I woke early before the alarm could buzz and lay for a moment beneath the covers, feeling the slow, steady rhythm of anticipation grow in my chest. There was no dread, no aching hollowness as there had been just days ago, only a quiet certainty that today would be different. I made a pot of coffee and stood by the kitchen window while it brewed, watching the sun push its way up through the trees in the backyard. The light painted everything in soft yellows and pinks, brushing the leaves with a delicate glow. I took it as a good omen. The checklist I had written in my battered notebook sat on the counter, each item meticulously crossed off except for the final one: celebrate. I smiled at it as I sipped my coffee, letting the warmth seep into me. After breakfast, I pulled out the decorations. The paper lanterns had arrived on time, neatly packed and ready to be hung. I spent most of the morning stringing them across the backyard, looping twine between the old oak tree and the fence posts, letting the colorful orbs dangle and sway gently in the breeze. The fairy lights went up next, twinkling faintly even in the midday sun, promising to turn the yard into a soft, glowing wonderland once night fell. Around noon, I set up the tables. I covered them with simple white cloths and placed small jars of fresh wildflowers at the center of each one. The scent of the blooms, lavender, daisies, and something sweet I couldn't quite name, drifted through the air, mingling with the smell of freshly cut grass. I arranged the food next, setting out platters of sandwiches, bowls of fruit, trays of cookies, and the sheet cakes I had baked the day before. Carol arrived just as I was placing the last plate, her arms full of wine bottles and a bouquet so large it looked like she had raided an entire flower shop. She hugged me tightly without a word and set to work helping me arrange everything. Joanne came a little later, balancing 2 peach cobblers and a bag of party favors she had insisted on bringing. Mr. Alvarez showed up in his work uniform, paint smudged on his hands, but grinning broadly as he offered a tub of homemade guacamole and a bag of chips. As the afternoon stretched on, more people trickled in, faces I hadn't seen in months, some in years. They came with smiles, with small gifts wrapped in colorful paper, with open arms and easy laughter. No one asked where Sarah or Derek or Rachel were. No one needed to. This was a different kind of family, one built not by blood, but by choice. The backyard filled slowly with the murmur of conversation, the clink of glasses, the occasional burst of laughter. I moved through the crowd with a lightness I hadn't felt in years, greeting each guest, exchanging stories, accepting their warmth without apology or hesitation. As the sun dipped lower in the sky and the lanterns began to glow against the deepening blue, I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was Carol, holding out a glass of wine and smiling that knowing, mischievous smile she had always worn when we were young and reckless. "To new beginnings," she said, raising her glass. I clinked mine against hers, the soft chime ringing out like a small, perfect bell. We stood there for a moment, just watching the children chase each other between the trees, watching the older couples sway gently to the music someone had put on in the background, watching the lanterns bob and dance in the evening breeze. It was simple, it was small, it was everything I had wanted. At some point during the evening, while refilling the lemonade pitcher, I caught sight of movement at the side gate. I turned just in time to see Sarah standing there, half hidden by the fence, her expression caught somewhere between curiosity and guilt. Derek stood behind her, his arms crossed, his face tight and unreadable. Rachel hovered near the sidewalk, fiddling with her car keys, casting furtive glances toward the laughter and lights spilling from the yard. They hadn't been invited, they hadn't been needed, they hadn't been missed. I watched them for a long moment, my heart steady in my chest. Part of me thought they might step inside, that they might try to explain, to smooth it over. But they didn't. After a few minutes, they turned away, their figures fading into the twilight. I let them go without a word, without regret. The celebration continued without them, richer and more vibrant for their absence. As darkness deepened and the stars pricked through the sky, I found myself laughing more easily, speaking more freely, feeling lighter than I had in years. Later that night, when the guests had gone and the tables stood empty under the swaying lanterns, I sat alone on the porch steps, a blanket wrapped around my shoulders. The soft hum of the fairy lights buzzed in the background, and the air smelled of damp earth and lingering flowers. I thought about how much I had feared this day when I first learned the truth, how broken and lost I had felt, believing that being left out meant being left behind. How wrong I had been. I wasn't left behind. I had simply outgrown the space they had allowed me, and in doing so, I had found something far more precious than any seat at their table. I had found myself, and as I sat there beneath the vast, star-scattered sky, I knew with a quiet certainty that this was only the beginning. The following morning, the house smelled faintly of last night's party, sweet wine, fresh flowers, and something warm and baked lingering in the air. I moved slowly through the kitchen, my body heavy with the pleasant fatigue that follows a good full day. Empty cake boxes and stacks of plates waited to be cleaned, but I didn't rush. I let the morning unfold gently, the way sunlight slowly fills a room. I wrapped myself in a thick cardigan, made a fresh pot of coffee, and sat by the kitchen window watching the backyard. The paper lanterns were still swaying lazily in the breeze, the last traces of the party clinging to the branches and fence posts. It looked beautiful in the morning light, a little worn, a little chaotic, but filled with memory. It made me smile. I thought the weekend's events had drawn a quiet but definitive line between me and the family I had once placed at the very center of my world. I had accepted it. I had made peace with it, or so I thought. But life has a way of stirring the ashes just when you believe the fire is out. It was late afternoon when I decided to run a few errands. I needed groceries and supplies to restock the bakery for the coming week. I pulled on a pair of comfortable shoes, grabbed my keys, and headed into town. The streets were busy with the usual weekend buzz, families gathering for late lunches, couples strolling past storefronts, children darting between their parents' legs. I had just finished loading a bag of groceries into my car when I heard someone call my name. The voice was hesitant, uncertain, but achingly familiar. I turned, and there was Rachel, standing a few feet away, holding a coffee cup in one hand and nervously twisting the strap of her purse with the other. For a moment, we simply stared at each other, two women separated by more than just a few feet of asphalt. There was an awkwardness between us, thick and clumsy, like a poorly patched quilt where the seams no longer held. I offered a small, cautious smile. It was all I could manage. Rachel stepped closer, her eyes wide, her mouth opening and closing as if searching for the right words. I didn't expect to see you here," she said finally, her voice too bright, too brittle. I shrugged, non-committal, just picking up a few things. She glanced down at the ground, then back at me, her face crumpling slightly. "We missed you at the party," she said, and the lie was so obvious it didn't even sting. I nodded slowly, letting the silence between us stretch. I had no interest in rescuing her from her discomfort. Rachel shifted from foot to foot, visibly struggling. "Sarah, she didn't mean to. I mean, it just sort of happened. It wasn't supposed to be." Her voice trailed off, tangled in the mess she couldn't untangle. I watched her, feeling a surprising swell of pity. Not anger, not bitterness, just a quiet, aching sadness for what could have been, for the connections frayed beyond repair. "I know," I said simply. Rachel's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them away quickly. She stepped even closer, lowering her voice. "You looked happy last night. We saw the lights. We heard the music." There was no accusation in her tone, only a weary sort of wonder. I sipped my coffee and said nothing. Rachel bit her lip. I guess we thought you needed us more than you did." It wasn't an apology, but it was the closest thing to the truth she had ever given me. I could have told her how much it had hurt. I could have told her about the nights spent wondering what I had done wrong, about the hours spent shrinking myself smaller and smaller in the desperate hope of fitting into the spaces they allowed me. I could have unspooled the whole ugly, aching story between us, but I didn't. Instead, I simply said, I needed myself more. Rachel nodded slowly, a tear slipping down her cheek despite her best efforts. She wiped it away and offered me a trembling smile. I'm glad, she whispered. For a moment, the two of us stood there, 1,000 memories crowding the space between us. Birthday parties and Christmas mornings, scraped knees and late-night talks, laughter and tears and the unspoken love that once had seemed so unshakable. And then, like a page turning in a book, the moment passed. Rachel stepped back. Maybe sometime we could have coffee, she asked, her voice tentative. I met her gaze steadily. Maybe. It wasn't a promise. It wasn't a door swinging wide open. It was a crack, a small one, enough for a sliver of light to slip through if she chose to step into it. We said our goodbyes, awkward but genuine, and I watched her walk back down the sidewalk, her figure small against the afternoon sun. I stood there for a while, feeling the warmth of the coffee cup seep into my palms, feeling the steady beat of my heart against my ribs. I had survived the loneliness. I had survived the betrayal. And I had survived the fragile hope that sometimes still tried to take root where it didn't belong. This meeting hadn't changed the past. But maybe, just maybe, it had changed the future. If not for us together, then at least for me. I climbed into my car, started the engine, and pulled away from the curb, the road stretching out ahead of me, wide and waiting. When I returned home that evening, the sky was painted in soft shades of pink and gold, the sun sinking slowly behind the rooftops, casting long shadows across the street. I pulled into the driveway and sat for a moment with the engine idling, watching the world settle into its quiet evening rhythms. A man walked his dog across the street, the leash slack between them. A mother called her children in for dinner from a porch 2 doors down. Life, ordinary and unremarkable, unfolded all around me, and for the first time in a long time, I felt no urgent need to chase it or prove anything to anyone. I turned off the engine, gathered my groceries, and stepped into the house. The scent of fresh flowers still lingered faintly in the air, a leftover whisper of last night's celebration. I set the bags down on the kitchen counter and took a deep breath, letting the quiet wrap itself around me like a soft blanket. The house, my house, had never felt more like mine. I moved through the room slowly, touching the backs of chairs, trailing my fingers along the banister, pausing in front of the photographs on the mantel. There were pictures of Sarah and Rachel as little girls, their faces smudged with birthday cake, their arms thrown around my neck. There were photos of Harold and me, young and laughing, before the weight of years and losses had carved deeper lines into our faces. There were snapshots of old friends, some long gone, some still calling once in a while, just to say hello. I didn't take the pictures down. I didn't hide them away. They were part of my story, part of the woman I had become, but they did not define my future. I made myself a simple dinner, a small plate of pasta with fresh basil from the pot on the windowsill, and ate it outside on the back porch. The air was cooler now, the last hints of summer giving way to the crisp edges of fall. I wrapped a shawl around my shoulders and listened to the quiet hum of the evening, the soft chirp of crickets, the distant bark of a dog, the occasional rumble of a car passing by. And as I sat there, watching the first stars blink into existence overhead, I realized that the choice before me was both simple and profound. I could continue to live in the shadow of what had been done to me, clinging to old wounds like a badge of honor, replaying the same hurt over and over until it hardened into bitterness. Or I could let it go. I could lay it down like a heavy coat that no longer fit, shrug it from my shoulders, and walk forward unburdened. I chose the latter, not because it excused what had happened, not because it erased the pain, but because my life was too precious to be spent orbiting around the absence of people who had decided to step away. I was not a footnote in someone else's story. I was the author of my own. The next morning, I opened the notebook where I had written my plan for the party, and I turned to a fresh page. At the top, I wrote, "My new beginning." I made a new list. Take a painting class at the community center. Adopt a dog from the shelter. Join the book club Joanne kept inviting me to. Spend a weekend at the coast, alone, just because. Learn to play the piano, no matter how terrible I might be at first. Volunteer at the local library. Plant a new garden in the front yard, wild and free, the way I had always secretly wanted. Every item on the list was something that made my heart stir a little, something that belonged solely to me. No obligations, no expectations, just small acts of reclaiming my own life. Later that week, I drove to the shelter and met an old Labrador with cloudy eyes and a slow, lumbering gait. His name was Charlie, and when he rested his head against my knee, I knew I was taking him home. Charlie and I settled into a quiet, contented routine. Morning walks through the neighborhood, afternoons spent dozing in the sun, evenings curled up on the couch with a book and a soft snore vibrating against my leg. He asked nothing of me except presence, and I gave it freely, happily. Word of my little party spread through town faster than I expected. People I hadn't seen in years dropped by the bakery, bringing stories and hugs, ordering more cakes and pies than I could keep up with. Some days, my hands ached from kneading and rolling and frosting, but my heart never did. One evening, as Charlie and I walked through the park near sunset, I passed a family gathering under the pavilion. Laughter floated through the air, the smell of barbecue and sweet tea lingering like perfume. For a moment, I paused, watching them, feeling a flicker of something that might once have been sorrow. But then Charlie nudged my hand with his wet nose, and I laughed, the sound ringing out into the evening air. I was not missing anything. I had chosen my life. I had chosen myself. And every step I took, every breath I drew, was a step away from the shadow of abandonment and towards something infinitely better. A life built not on duty or expectation, but on joy, honesty, and the quiet, fierce love I had finally learned to give myself. As the stars began to wink into the sky above us, Charlie and I kept walking, the path stretching wide and welcoming before us.